The U-2 is often termed the most difficult airplane in the world to land. And there's a lot of aviators in this room that just take out the red flag and throw down on that saying, what do you mean? Why is that so difficult? Okay, how many of the aviators in here are tailwheel drivers? A few, a couple, I only see a couple of hands. Okay, so a tailwheel airplane adds a little bit to the experience of aviation. But if you take away one of the training wheels in the front, and you only have one in the front and one in the back, then it becomes a little bit more difficult, but still this is doable. And then when you think the fuel that you have is in the wings, so here you have fuel in the wings, but they built the airplane extremely light. And one of the things they did away with, baffles. So when you land, and a wing goes down a little bit, the fuel on this side starts running to the root, the fuel on this side starts running to the tip, and if you don't move the yoke pretty quickly, it goes down further and further, and they built little downturned winglets, if you will, and the bottom of it's got little titanium, consider it like brake pad stuff, so that if you do put it on the ground, you can skid along the ground and put sparks out and stuff. But the idea is to try and keep the wings level all the time. How many people have been told to keep their wings level all the time once you're on the ground? Yes, but it's more difficult when you have a challenge like that. And the other thing is that, okay, if I want to cross the threshold at the proper speed in order to land the airplane in the allotted space that I have in front of me, I have to cross the threshold 0 knots from my predicted speed to 2 knots above it to stay in Stanival. This is a good landing criteria. Why? Because the U-2, once it gets in the ground effect, wants to float and float. And every knot equates to 1,000 feet of float. And can you land it on the main gear like you do other tailwheel airplanes? No, because they built the strut in such a way that it compresses just a little bit, and if the tail goes down infinitesimally, it bounds you about 10 feet up in the air, you stall at 10 feet, come crashing down, the strut goes through the main fuel tank that goes to the engine, and that's not nice. So, you have to stall it at about 1 to 2 feet above the ground. Ideally, I get the tail wheel running on the ground while I'm holding the main gear off, and I keep going like that, but it's not just coming back with the yoke, because the wings are trying to stall at different speeds, so I'm moving the yoke from stop to stop while I'm coming back. Those of you who have flown the T-38, the pitch is as sensitive as the T-38. Those who have flown big, other aircraft that are big, the roll is about as sensitive as a 737, okay? And there's no hydraulics in it. It is shoulder power. Okay, so you're doing all like this, trying to keep it straight, trying to keep the wheels lined up. Because if you ever think about a bicycle and a motocross type event to where you're gonna hit a hill, jump up, and then if you turn sideways a little bit while you're in the air and you come down and you touch down with both wheels at the same time, what happens to you and the bike? You flop over. And that's what happens to this airplane. It starts to go this way, and now you start to get in the back end squirrely, and it starts going back and back. Somebody earlier said there are those who have and those that will. In the U-2 community, we talk about that of going off the runway. But fortunately enough, simple enough airplane, you go over to it, you tie a rope around the tail wheel, you tow it back onto the runway, you kick the dirt out of the tires, and it's about ready to go again, unless you've done something really bad. Like a friend of mine, this happened to him, but it just so happened the barrier housing was right where he went off the runway, so it just tore the main gear out from the inside like a bee's stinger would come out. So that's why the U-2, plus you're wearing a big, bulky pressure suit, and then you put something around your face so your peripheral vision that pilots always use to try and see how high you are is restricted. And so, yes, Landing a U-2 is pretty darn difficult. Now, I haven't flown every airplane in the world, but I have talked to test pilots who have flown 40 to 50 aircraft, and those that have had the opportunity to fly the U-2 as well, all of them agree it's the most difficult airplane in the world. However, take it up to altitude, and it's a piece of cake. I used to keep a little paperback, bring out my paperback, and I'm reading while I'm on orbit. I'm flying for 8 to 12 hours in an orbit, and I'm reading, okay, everything's good. Every 30 minutes, make a fuel check, oxygen quantity. But I'm just flying around, and I have to get all pumped up to land it. Because, oh boy, we call it the Dragon Lady. And some days you dance with the lady, and other times you wrestle with the dragon. So that's my little story about the U-2. Now, I'm going to introduce you to the SR, and almost everything else except a smattering of F4 is going to be about the SR-71. Now, some of you were born after the last SR-71 was in the air. I'm sorry. That's why I have a video here, so you can see some of this beautiful airplane. I think it's the sexiest airplane that was ever built. The other thing is, in this particular video, I want you to look for a few things. I want you to look for the fuel that's puddled under the airplane during different things. I want you to look for a green flash because the fuel is so non-combustible that igniter plugs, which is what you normally use in a jet engine to fire the fuel and to get a spark, does not light it. Typically, if you had a bucket of this fuel and you take a match and you throw it into it, the fire marshal goes crazy and the flame goes out, okay? So I want you to look for that and the two other things. There is one instance in this film dedicated to the SR-71's inventor, Kelly Johnson. So you'll see him there. Unfortunately, he was near the end of his life. He's suffering dementia. You'll see a picture of him just before he died. But the whole program is supposed to be a dedication to him. And the final thing I want you to look for, and I'm going to ask this question at the end, you'll see a clue as to what is alike between the SR-71 and a 1925 Ford Tri-Motor. So if the gentleman in the back can cue up the video, we'll watch about 5 minutes of a video, and then you'll have to listen to me talk a little more.
Dear Kelly, you and I have never met. I'm not a former SR-71 pilot or RSO. I wasn't a member of your design team at the Lockheed Skunk Works or on the assembly line that built the Blackbird. Nor was I a member of the Air Force at Beale, Mildenhall, or Kadena, who kept the Blackbirds flying. I'm not even an airplane buff in the classic sense. I'm just a person that had the privilege of being around your SR-71 Blackbird, and it was an experience I will remember intensely for the rest of my life. There's just something about your Blackbird, Kelly, that words don't adequately describe. Anyone who has been near a Blackbird and felt its presence knows what I'm talking about. It's a feeling in your gut, and instantly you want to be part of it. Part of what I call the Blackbird family. Today, Kelly, you are being honored for your design work on the SR-71, and justly so. To me, the SR-71 is not only your greatest aircraft design, it is perhaps the greatest aircraft ever built. I've heard it said that you considered the Blackbird the most fascinating challenge of your career. No wonder. It was a design that was so advanced that everything that touched it had to be new. New manufacturing processes, new tools, new materials, a whole new approach. You built an operational stealth aircraft a decade before most of the world had even heard the term. It was a design so far ahead of its time that it retired before time could catch up with it. In times of crisis, the Blackbird provided 6 presidents with a unique and critical view of the world. The Blackbird served this country for just over a quarter of a century, and that entire time it stood in a class of one. To me, the Blackbird is much more than a technical marvel. It's an airplane that gets inside you, an aircraft that causes the adrenaline to flow just by looking at it. Kelly, your Blackbird is the stuff dreams are made of. It's the model plane sitting in a young child's room, proof that everything is possible, that the sky isn't the limit. And it's the poster hanging on the office wall of a middle-aged engineer, testimony that yes, even in the real world, miracles do occur. The SR-71 embodies all that excites people about aerospace. Its crew seems part pilot, part astronaut. The Blackbird itself appears part airplane, part spacecraft. The typical Blackbird fan is a cross-section of America. It's your grandfather, your niece, your son. It's the wide-eyed young kid that buys an aircraft book at the National Air and Space Museum. It's the family that traveled hundreds of miles to an air show just to see a Blackbird in person. It's the people on the Air Force Base that stopped what they were doing to watch an SR take off. Everyone, every time, no matter how many times they'd seen it before. And it's the pilot who last flew the Blackbird 20 years ago, who has the look in his eye that says, I flew the best aircraft ever made. The look that can barely contain the desire to get in an SR just one more time and light the burners. When Blackbird 972 made its final record-setting flight to Dulles Airport, I watched the television with mixed emotions. This was the Blackbird's final flight. An aircraft that was the very definition of speed and power would fly no more. But my sadness was tempered by the knowledge that this plane would now truly belong to the nation, coming to rest in the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum. Now millions would be able to do what I had done, be near a Blackbird, be part of the family. Kelly, in the years to come, whenever I want to experience your airplane's majesty, I will remember the time I spent with your Blackbird, the smell of JP7 fuel, the feel of it on the soles of my shoes, the sound of an air starter wind up, the TEV ignite, and I'll put on the film that we shot during those incredible weeks in 1987. I'll watch it, feel it, be part of it again. Because in movies, Kelly, like in our memories, your Blackbird will fly forever. Congratulations, Kelly, and thank you. Devin Hawker, Assistant Cameraman, Blackbird, the movie.
Up the other program, the CEO of Lockheed once said, and I quote, "That Swede can see air." He was a Swedish person that Kelly Johnson was. So I was lucky enough to be able to fly this airplane. And we'll go through a few things because I don't want to keep you too long. Next slide. So my first aircraft to fly after pilot training was the F-4. It's a beast. It's the proverbial, often said, it proves the fact that if you take a brick and put enough thrust on it, it'll fly. And there is nothing like unloading to a half a G, lighting the burners, and seeing an instantaneous 50 knots appear. And so that airplane, kind of my, first ship, first aircraft, first love. Next slide, please. Now, this is the family of the Blackbirds. The A-12 is a single-seat Blackbird, only has one person in it, It only had one camera directly behind the pilot, like the camera in the early U-2s were. And then they evolved it into something else, next slide, called the YF-12, which was an interceptor version. So they put a radar in the nose, they mounted missiles inside of it, and proved that you can open the weapon bay doors, missile comes out, launches at Mach 3. You know, a lot of people think, oh, you can't do that because you're going faster than the missile goes because it's, quote, a Mach 3 missile. People don't realize that Mach 3 missiles take the speed of the airplane and then add their Mach 3 to it. And so it's a really nice missile to go flying out with the idea it was gonna stop the Soviet bombers from hitting the United States. Next slide. This is a concoction of, it's a two-seat airplane, but it has a drone on the back of it that's also Mach 3 plus. And when it was flown twice, they had 2 good launches, and then on the third launch, when the drone was released, something went wrong, and the drone pitched back into the airplane, hit it, destroyed the airplane. Both guys got out, but one guy drowned in the water when his face mask opened up inadvertently. And they said, nope, we're killing that program. This particular drone was dropped off of B-52s later on, but it had to accelerate with a rocket motor attached to it to get it up to Mach 3 to where it could run itself. Next slide. And then finally, the SR-71. They had a fly-off for a while because the A-12s were using the CIA was using A-12s, and a little later on, the Air Force said, we want to play that game. And so, but they built a better airplane that had two people in it, divide the workload, and also, instead of just a single camera looking straight down where you had to overfly things, they built cameras that could look to the side. They mounted cameras in those weapon bays that they had created for the missiles, but now the cameras, so when you tilt it up like this, you could look to the sides, and also put in valence. So the A-12 was a one-horse pony, one trip. The SR-71 had many more things it could do, so that's why during the fly-off, because Congress had said, hey guys, choose one or the other, we're not gonna pay for both of these. Next slide. It is a beautiful looking airplane, and several things about it that, by the way, did anybody notice what was the same between a SR-71 and the Ford Tri-Motor? Yes, sir. No, not the assembly line. That's a good answer, though. Yes, sir. The corrugated panels on the top of the wings of the SR and the Ford Tri-Motor is made entirely of corrugated aluminum panels. Now, the biggest problem with the SR-71 or any of the Blackbird aircraft is heat and having to deal with heat. So I'm going to go through just a couple of things for you. The outside of the airplane got heated up by going through the air, and the friction of the airplane to the air generated heat. And it was painted black, and everybody goes, well, black absorbs heat, you're gonna cause a problem to have painted black. But in reality, black absorbs heat and also is the best radiator of heat. But if it was absorbing heat from the sun, you wouldn't want it black. But if it's absorbing heat from friction, now it can get rid of that heat faster, and the whole airplane became 50 degrees cooler when it was black versus when it was shiny. And then they didn't have an oil that could stand the temperatures. They didn't have any hydraulic fluid that could stand the temperatures. They didn't have any fuel that could stand the temperature. They didn't have an engine that could last an hour and a half. At that time, the best engine could go, an afterburner was 15 minutes. Then a little later, they came out with J75, and it could just barely make 30 minutes before it had to be out of burner. But we wanted this one to be continuous in burner, because I flew in burner the entire time except when I'm refueling. Yeah. Even the electrical wires. I bet you there's a few EAA members that build their own airplanes in here. I'd be surprised if we don't have home built. But imagine if you build an airplane and you go buy wiring at the store and you find out when you put it in your airplane the insulation on the wire melts at the temperature you're flying the airplane. The solder that you use to solder the thing together melts. So you have to come up with lots of new things. And even though titanium was a metal that they knew of, they didn't know how to work it, forge it, weld it, or do any of the other things that you need to do to assemble an airplane. They had to learn all of that while they're building the airplane. Next slide. It's a pretty looking airplane, and it does leak fuel. And we sometimes hear that the airplane uses Facebook. I get so irritated when somebody says, yeah, it was designed to leak fuel. And I go, BS, pardon me, I usually use it longer term. And no engineer is going to design an airplane to leak fuel. What happened is that this airplane has the outside of the aircraft as the skin of the fuel tank. And they use sealant, and the best sealant of the time couldn't stand up to the constant go fast and high, hot, and then cool off, and then hot, cool off. So when it came out of the factory, right away it didn't leak fuel. And then slowly it started dripping, and they wrote down, okay, you can have so many drips per minute from this spot, so many drips. And when it started to exceed it, then you had to go into, and they had neat terms for a lot of things. And you can just imagine some of them. So if you needed to get into the fuel cell in order to help seal it again, they had boy holes. That was the name for it. Pardon if it's not politically correct anymore. They didn't have a manhole because that'd be too big. They'd have a boy hole, and it was about 2 people in each squadron that was small enough that could get in there and actually do this. Then they had other things like, you know, you have any kind of engine. Any engine in the world's usually got something spinning in it, and quite often the shaft that's spinning sticks out of it, and you have to have a seal. We all know about oil seals and other types of things. Well, they had some things in this airplane called germ seals. Imagine what it's trying to keep in, not germs, but it's got such a small tolerance that somebody once said, man, that's so tight it would keep germs from getting through. That became its name, germ seal. And then, next slide. We refueled almost every mission. And some of the people who say, the airplane leaked so much fuel that it had to refuel right off the takeoff, didn't know that quite often we, early in the program, had what was called a rocket ride. We would take off out of Kadena, which is in Okinawa, Japan, and we'd fly a mission across the DMZ. Now the DMZ is 775 miles away. The DMZ is about 150 miles wide. So you go 775 miles, make a right-hand turn, go by the DMZ, turn around, and fly the same distance back for a total of about 1,800 miles, depending on how things went. And you would do that without refueling. We had to fill the airplane up and then bring the fuel down a little bit. And one of the other things is that even with the fuel that we used, that had the highest flash point going, if you didn't replace the air that's in a tank that comes when you're using fuel, and that airspace above that is called ullage, if you didn't replace it with something inert, then you reach the 3 legs that the Boy Scouts learned. You got fuel, you got something to ignite it, the temperature, and you got oxygen in there. So we flew with dewars which are just big containers, of liquid nitrogen, and that was pumped into each tank like a soaker hose would. Liquid nitrogen went in, bubbled up through the fuel, and became gaseous oxygen as the fuel burned down, not to cool the fuel, but to make sure that the top of it was inert so you wouldn't have a fire. If we didn't have liquid nitrogen, we were restricted to 2.6 Mach. Well, lots of people would like to go 2.6 Mach, but that wasn't what our design was. So that mission I was talking about, take off, fly by the DMZ, and come back, started a competition amongst the guys. How fast can I do this? So you take off, you start to accelerate and climb. You're going through the Mach at about 25,000 feet because we're not over the United States. We can go supersonic wherever we want. I'm at 75,000 feet, Mach 3 in 12 minutes. I go up to the DMZ, turn around, and the best guy who won it, I know the colonel that did this, he wasn't a colonel at the time, 57 minutes. When you look at that distance, that's nearly 1,900 miles in 57 minutes, that becomes an impressive time for doing something. So, you can look at the shape, the forward part of the airplane, the part that looks like a manta ray that kind of sticks out like this, that created the first stealth airplane. And although I work for Lockheed and I'm in the F-35 program, and I can't tell you all sorts of secrets about it, if you look at the SR-71 and you see the shape of the chines, and if you look carefully at a F-22 or an F-35, you'll see the resemblance of a little bit of pointed chine right on the edge of it about the waterline. And that's all because that makes it a little stealthier and be able to reflect radar beams out a little bit. This was the first stealth airplane. Now, no, everybody was looking for it with radar. Today, you'd look for it with IR. This would stand out from 300 miles from IR. So it's not your bring it back and it'd be good. No, not a problem. Next slide. And that's just another good view of it. Next slide. Now here's my alien. This is a selfie of the alien flying the SR-71. If you look at it, that's a reflection of my face mask, and what is in the front, that little square by the triangles, is where the Nikon F2 camera was set, so it could take a picture facing the pilot and reflecting out, and you can see what the visibility was like. Because today, if you get the chance to go to one of the SRs on display in the museum, the seats are all the way down, and you get in it, you sit down, and you're looking kind of like eyeball to eyeball with the steering wheel would be in a car. You're way too low. And you can see that visibility was pretty good in there, even though you had a splitter right in front of you and triangle panes and that sort of thing. Next slide. And it's just a really neat airplane. Notice the outboard wings are rotated down just a little bit. A neat feature, technically called negative conical camber, but what's neat about it is by rotating them down like that, at maximum Mach, you decrease the lift of the wings on the outer panels, so you don't have to stress the items of the machine that goes around the engines. But when you get really slow coming into land, the outboard sections are at a lower angle of attack, so you have great roll authority and control over the airplane. Next slide. Now, I'm going to cover just a few of the myths. Next one. And I have to look at them to make sure I know which one to talk about. There was a modeling company one time that said, hey, buy my model and here's all the colors that you... How many people built models over their life? Quite a few. And you always look at the instructions and they say, make it out of blue. It turned out that this modeling company had an excess of blue and they decided to sell this. It's never been blue. It's not blue, it's black. Next slide. The maximum speed is not classified. The design maximum speed was 3.3, and that was because of the compressor inlet temperature limit being at 427 degrees centigrade. And if it got hotter than that, the blades would grow and start scoring the inside of the engine. And generally, that's not a good thing to have happen when you're flying. So there have been people who, when the temperatures outside are much colder than standard, have been able to take it faster than that. There was one test pilot who pushed it out to nearly 3.5. One other pilot is a good friend of mine that was about 3.47. And it was simply because he was in min-Mach, trying to climb, min-burner, trying to climb, and the temperature's so cold, the airplane was just running away with itself. But the design speed was 3.3, and we normally hardly ever exceeded 3.2. Next slide. It replaced the U-2, which is still flying. Yeah, okay. Next slide. It was designed by a slide rule. Next slide. There were thousands of missiles shot at it over Vietnam and other places. one of the A-12s who flew over Vietnam prior to the SR flying over the Vietnam was hit by one little piece about the size of a BB, they found it. Never was an SR-71 hit, although many more shots at it than the A-12s were. The A-12s only flew operationally for 1 year. Next slide. It is not still classified except for one area. My flight manual that I have has 45 pages missing out of it. These are in the electronic warfare section because part of that is flying in another stealthy looking bomber airplane right now. Next slide. We did not get astronaut wings. The highest we went was somewhere between 17 miles in the sky, 85,000 to 90,000 feet, and you don't get astronaut wings until you've passed 50 miles in the sky. Next slide. It is faster than a 30-06 bullet. Just think about this. The muzzle velocity of a 30-06 bullet is 3,000 feet per second, and when we were cruising at 3,200 feet per second. Now, what I tell my school kids when I'm giving them classes, you know, what's the concept of Mach 3? What's this idea? Okay, here in Tulsa, you've got some great roads that allow you to vision this. You've got some little hills, and you also have some flyovers or roads that cross it. You have a sign that says, you know, I'm just gonna give a name that I remember, Yale or Harvard, and you've got a bridge that flies 44 or something like that. I don't have the geography correct here, but you can say, okay, when you pass that sign, count 1001, 1002, and now you're crossing the bridge. And when you look at that over there, and you didn't seem to move when your folks are driving at 70 miles an hour, and yet the airplane has already passed that. And it gives anyone the concept of how fast you're moving. And for those of you who flew military airplanes in here, maybe even what we call fast jets, I've flown the F4 at Mach 2.2, and the first thing I'm looking for once I get it to 2.2, someplace to land, because I've just run it out of gas to get it that fast. And most of the modern day fighters that are labeled as Mach 2 airplanes or Mach 1.8, same thing. They don't cruise there. We cruised for over an hour and a half at Mach 3. And the most interesting feature about the airplane is that if on my fuel curve, I'm keeping track of the fuel and I see that I'm going below the fuel curve, I accelerate to make the fuel get better because the airplane was more fuel efficient. We never could reach the maximum speed to where it went past what we call LOVD max on the bottom of the curve. We were always behind the curve, so you just could keep going faster and faster, and you were making ground at less fuel flow. It's one of the most fascinating things. Next slide. It was designed to leak fuel. I've already covered that one. Next slide. And it did not glow in flight. In the dark, you couldn't see it glowing. Sometimes some little pieces would fly off, the little sealant you could see coming off of it, and it'd be like sparks going by, but it didn't glow. And by the time you got to the ground, it was cool enough for the guys to start downloading the equipment as soon as you landed. However, we were careful about, if we're coming down off of a hot leg, and if I can avoid between 20 and 35,000 feet flying through a rainstorm, I would. Why? The leading part of the SR-71 was put together with dimpled washers, titanium washers, and a screw right in the center of it that was flush mounted. If I went through a rainstorm, those titanium washers were heated up enough from my flight that the rain would actually peel the leading edge of the washer back and cover the head of the screw. And by the time I landed, the titanium had cooled off and annealed again to where you can't get the screw out until you call somebody who's got a big enough drill with enough power to get rid of that little piece. So we really tried to avoid it, and we owed the crew chief a case of beer if we did that. You know, next slide. Yep, they are prima donnas and terribly obnoxious people. So, I would like to take questions now, if anybody has anything they'd like to know about the airplane. There is nothing classified about it at all. No questions? I've never had a class that had no questions. I must have been so good telling you everything that you didn't have a question. The simplest thing. I mean, why were the wheels white? White wall tires, 1957. Yeah. What's that?
What's your call sign?
I was called Stormy. The story behind that is not an aviation story. My dad is a Pearl Harbor survivor. His name was Lionel P. Boudreaux Jr. He never went by Lionel. My grandfather was alive. He was the only Lionel. So my dad had a nickname, and he, because of Navy folklore, and in Navy folklore, they had a bigger than life, like Pecos Bill kind of character called Storm Along AB. And my dad decided to call me Stormy. I've been Stormy since I'm 3 weeks old. Air Force thought that was a good enough title, and I kept that. The only time I had a slight modifications when I was flying F4s, I got into the fast vac business, and the call sign of that fast vac unit was Stormy. So they started calling me Stormy Squared while I was in there. Any other questions?
How many were built, Blackbird?
29 A models were built, 2 trainers were built. They lost one of the 11 of the A models were lost, not in to combat, but during testing and stuff. And then because they lost one of the trainers, so they only had 1 trainer left, they found a engineering example of the cockpit, and they had one of the YF-12's bodies left. They took the regular cockpit off of it, merged the two together, and I'm sorry to say that one was called the Bastard. But it flew weird. We hardly ever flew that one. Another question? The runway at Beale was typically, or a runway at Beale is 12,000 feet long. Lots of times we flew off of an 8,000 foot runway. 5,000 feet was adequate to land it if the drag chute worked. 10,000 feet was nice if your drag chute didn't work, but you were going to burn up the brakes if you had to get on binders if it was less than 10,000 feet. But 4,500 feet down the runway is where I rotated the nose at about 210 knots. And if you ever watch the film of the SR-71 and you see what looks like the pilot hot dogging it and pulling the gear up early, it's because single engine flight characteristics, and this is another one of those unusual things. Most aviators out here know that you have hydraulics to lower gear, and if the hydraulics aren't working, like if that's working off of one motor and you lose that motor, then there's usually some means of an alternate gear extension for it to free fall or get blown down by air or some other method. And usually there's only one method to pull up the gear. But in the SR-71, there's one hydraulic system to lower it, but 2 hydraulic systems to raise it. Why? Because if you lost the engine right after you rotated, the yawing that would occur is pretty bad. But if the nose gear stayed down, think of it like a sail or a canard sticking out, and now it's going to help spin you off to the side. So when you raised the gear, and you raised it right away, it had 2 systems to raise the gear, but only one to get it back down again, which is bizarre in aviation. But it was because of the circumstances of a single engine, being safe for single engine takeoff. It's one of those other oddities. I think we're about, I'm sure these people over here are nodding off, so it's time.